Human rights are moral principles or norms that describe certain standards of human behaviour. They are regularly protected by municipal and international law. Every human being in the world has 30 individual human rights that they can choose to follow or not follow. It's up to them. If you're living in the UK, for example, 2 of the human rights that you would be entitled to is free healthcare by the National Health Service, or the NHS, and every child is entitled to free education. How have they changed over time? Well, the human rights have been updated and regularly protected even more by different organisations and treaties that have been introduced over time. 3 of those organisations are the Geneva Convention, the European Convention of Human Rights, and the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Geneva Convention is set up of 4 different treaties and 3 additional protocols which establish the international standards of law for humanitarian treatment in war. The first Geneva Convention was set up on the 22nd of August 1864 for the amelioration of the conditions of the wounded in armies in the field. This is what set up the first 4 treaties of the Geneva Convention. Because of the horrific deaths, tortures and treatments that soldiers and civilians had suffered during the First and Second World Wars, the Geneva Convention had to add 2 more treaties to it in 1929 and 1949. Now, these 2 treaties gave prisoners of war basic human rights so they could feel as though they could actually do something during their time of being held captive. And an example of this for a major change in the 1949 treaty would be the Holocaust during the Second World War. These 2 treaties also established protections for civilians and non-combatants in and around the war zone, as well as establishing protections for the sick and the wounded. And because all the buildings had been destroyed during these 2 conflict times, people started taking shelter in churches and hospitals as a form of either hiding from the conflict zone or being nursed back up to health by doctors and nurses. Now, these 2 treaties prohibit hospitals and churches being bombed upon because it's what people were taking refuge in to seek protection, and they are also from the sick and the wounded as well, and therefore it is protection and it is against the Geneva Convention to bomb churches and hospitals. There were 2 major problems with these 2 treaties at the time, as they did not address the use of weapons properly in the war or the biochemical warfare, as it was because of these 2 treaties were mainly about people involved in conflict and war at the time, either soldiers or civilians. There were 2 conferences held in The Hague in 1899 and 1907 to talk about the use of weapons in war. Soldiers and other people were firing against other unarmed civilians, which then counted as murder because they could not defend themselves. They were just firing upon them, killing lots of people. The Geneva Convention then added the Hague Conventions to it, which prohibited the use of weapons against unarmed people, as that would be counted as murder. Now, going on to the biochemical warfare, this was then made into a Geneva Protocol which prohibited the use of asphyxiating, poisonous gases or any other gases or bacteriological methods of warfare. They prohibited this because of the use of mustard gas used during the Second World War, as it affected people's sights and their breathing, or maybe even melting their lungs. The United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights was first drafted out by representatives from all different legal and cultural backgrounds from all over the world. It was then proclaimed by the United Nations in Paris on the 10th of December 1948 under the General Assembly Resolution 217A. It sets out to achieve common standards of achievements from all people and in all nations, as well as also setting out fundamental human rights to be universally protected, and as a result of this it has been translated into 500 different languages and is used all over the world. This declaration was set up because of the disregard and contempt for human rights that have resulted in barbaric events that have happened over the course of history. These barbaric events have caused an outrage in the conscience of mankind and then sets out as an advent in a world in which people can enjoy freedom of speech, belief, and freedom out of fear, and since then it has been proclaimed as the highest aspiration among the common people. The European Convention of Human Rights is an international treaty set up to protect human rights and fundamental freedoms in Europe. It was first drafted in 1950 by the then newly formed Council of Europe and then put into force on the 3rd of September 1953. All Council of Europe member states are party to the Convention, and any new members wishing to enter the Convention are expected to ratify it at an earliest opportunity. The European Convention of Human Rights have also created the European Court of Human Rights. Now what this is any person who feels as though his or her human rights have been violated under the Convention by the states concerned, they can take the case to court. Judgments finding violations are binding on the states concerned, and they are obliged to execute these judgments. The committee ministers of the Council of Europe are monitoring these judgments to ensure payment is awarded by the court to the applicant as a form of compensation to the damage they have caused. These compensation sizes can be rather large, such as the 2014 incident where Russia was ordered to pay £2 billion in compensation to the former shareholders of Yukos. Now what happened was that the former shareholder of Yukos was arrested and stripped of all his money because he was the biggest and most successful company in Russia at the time. And the other leaders of Europe corrupted the police force at the time and arrested the former shareholders of Yukos to make sure their bank failed. Now this was a rather large compensation payment put forward to ensure that the company can build straight back up again. I'm now going to be talking about how these conventions have been successful in some places where they haven't been quite so successful. I'm going to start off with the Geneva Convention. Now the first place where that had been successful was when the Ottawa Treaty of 1999 had been added to it, banning the use of landmines. These landmines, before the treaty had entered the Geneva Convention, killed an estimated number of 20,000 people a year, but after the treaty had been entered to the Geneva Convention, that number had dropped from 20,000 people a year to 3,500 a year. That is 16,500 people a year that have been saved by this treaty added to the Geneva Convention. However, because civilians and non-combatants are still being killed by these landmines, it goes to show how this treaty is not enforced as it should do, as it goes against the Geneva Convention for firing upon or killing any unarmed combatants or civilians. Another place where the Geneva Convention hadn't been so successful is the Kosovo War. The Kosovo War had an estimated number of 13,517 people killed or went missing in the conflict, and the Yugoslavian and Serbian forces had caused a displacement of between 1.2 million people and 1.45 million people that have fled their own country due to the conflict zone. This also goes against the Geneva Convention because of civilians are being caught in the crossfire, and they're also causing deaths as well, and the buildings, their homes, are all being destroyed, and they're seeking shelter somewhere else because there is a war going on in their own country. I'm not going to be talking about how the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights has been successful and how the other parts have not been quite successful or effective. The United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights was to allow human rights to be protected by all people in all nations all over the world, therefore meaning universal. This linking into the LGBT community and how they didn't have quite so many human rights as the legislations weren't in place to help protect them. If you remember the LGBTQ+ community, the Equality Act linking to sexual orientation of 2003 and 2007 have made it illegal to discriminate against anyone who is a different sexual orientation, either being gay or straight or mixing up their sexualities to either liking men or women or maybe both. Or maybe even transgender as well. Their rights have been protected by these two acts as well. However, the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights has also been criticised because of they're mainly emphasising individual rights in the western parts of the world and not so much on the communal rights in the eastern part of the world, where their human rights are more shared amongst each other rather than each individual person. For my final part in the evaluation into the effectiveness, I'm going to be talking about the European Convention of Human Rights. Now, the European Convention of Human Rights are binding on the states concerned, and any person who feels as though his or her human rights have been violated by the states concerned, they can take the case to court. This court is known as the European Court of Human Rights, and they deal with any violations or damage that has been caused by the states concerned, and any damage or violations that have been found, they are obliged to execute any judgments or punishments to the states as a form of compensation to the damage they have caused to either an individual or a group of people or an organisation. It has been effective because it has allowed the number of hate crimes and human rights violations to be decreased ever since the convention has been introduced, allowing people to live their lives a lot more freely and comfortably without the fear of their human rights being violated. However, it has not been quite so successful because there are still some people still having their human rights being violated by the states concerned, and the European Court of Human Rights cannot deal with all these violations all at once. So they could, however, link it to the state's highest or some other court system that allows them to deal with the violations as well as only the European Court of Human Rights